My entire family thought I was the daughter who would never become anything. They never realized I was the only person my grandmother trusted with the truth. For most of my life, I had learned to accept the role my family gave me. I was Emily Carter, the daughter who was always compared to her older brother Daniel, the one who was told she needed to be more realistic, more successful, more like him. My parents, Richard and Laura Carter, never said they hated me. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, they showed their disappointment in small ways. The way my father changed the subject when someone asked about my career. The way my mother praised Daniel's achievements at every family gathering while barely mentioning mine. The way they looked at me like I was still trying to figure out what everyone else had already figured out. I was 32 years old, living in a small apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, working a steady job that paid my bills and allowed me to live independently. It was not the glamorous life my parents wanted for me, but I was proud of the person I had become. The one person who always saw that was my grandmother, Evelyn Carter. Grandma Evelyn never measured people by their titles, their bank accounts, or the way they looked on paper. She cared about kindness, loyalty, and the way someone treated others when nobody was watching. She was the person who reminded me that being different did not mean being less. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening in November, everything changed. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. I expected a regular message from a coworker or a reminder about an appointment. Instead, I saw my grandmother's name on the screen. My heart immediately felt lighter. Grandma Evelyn was 78 years old and had always been the calmest person I knew. But when I opened the message, I noticed something strange. It was only 3 words. 3 words that made me stop breathing for a moment. Look underfloor. I stared at the screen, waiting for another message to appear. Maybe she had accidentally sent it. Maybe there was more coming. But nothing happened. I called her. Immediately. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. A feeling I could not explain settled over me. My grandmother was careful with her words. She never sent confusing messages. She never asked for help directly unless something truly mattered. The next morning, I drove 3 hours to her house in a quiet neighborhood where every porch looked familiar and every tree along the street seemed to hold a memory. When I arrived, I saw my parents' car parked outside. That surprised me. They had not mentioned visiting Grandma Evelyn. I walked toward the front door, but before I could knock, I heard my father's voice inside. She just needs to stop worrying about things she doesn't understand. I froze. My father was talking about my grandmother. Then I heard my mother reply softly, "Emily doesn't need to be involved. She always makes things more complicated." I stood there silently, my hand resting on the doorknob. For years, they had believed I was the least important person in the family, the one who would never notice anything, the one they never had to explain themselves to. But they were wrong, because my grandmother had chosen me. And whatever secret she was trying to reveal, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally going to find out why. The moment I stepped inside my grandmother's house, I noticed something I had never felt there before. A quietness that did not feel peaceful. It felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Grandma Evelyn's home had always been my safe place. The smell of fresh coffee, the old wooden bookshelf near the living room window, and the small collection of family photographs on the walls had always made me feel like I belonged. But that morning, everything felt different. My father, Richard, was standing near the kitchen counter with a serious expression. My mother, Laura, sat at the table holding a cup of tea she barely touched. When they saw me, their faces changed. Not with surprise, with discomfort. "Emily, what are you doing here?" my father asked. His voice was calm, but I could hear the concern underneath it. "Grandma sent me a message yesterday," I replied. I was worried because she did not answer my calls. My mother quickly looked away. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. For most of my life, I had been the person people underestimated. They assumed I missed things. They assumed I was too emotional to understand what was happening around me. But I had spent years quietly observing. I knew when someone avoided a question. I knew when a smile was not genuine. Your grandmother has been confused lately, my mother said. At her age, people sometimes send strange messages. I looked toward the hallway leading to Grandma Evelyn's bedroom. Something about her explanation did not feel right. My grandmother was many things, but confused was not one of them. She remembered every birthday, every family story, every small detail from decades ago. She was the woman who could tell me what dress I wore at my high school graduation and what I said afterward when I felt nervous about the future. "Can I see her?" I asked. My father stepped forward before answering. "She is resting." "I drove 3 hours," I said quietly. "I just want to make sure she is okay." The room became silent. That silence told me more than their words did. Eventually, my father moved aside and allowed me to walk down the hallway. When I entered my grandmother's room, I saw her sitting by the window. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were still the same. Clear, focused, aware. The moment she saw me, her expression changed. It was only for a second, but I saw relief. She reached for my hand and held it tightly. "You came," she whispered. I nodded. "Grandma, what did you mean by your message?" She looked toward the closed bedroom door, making sure we were alone. Then she opened the drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn from years of use. She placed it in my hands, but did not let go immediately. "I knew they would never expect you to look," she said softly. My stomach tightened. "Look at what?" I asked. She glanced toward the hallway where my parents were waiting. "The truth." Those 2 words stayed with me, because for the first time in my life, I realized something important. My family had always treated me like I was the person who understood the least. But my grandmother had chosen me because she believed I was the person who would look the closest. I opened the notebook slowly. Inside were pages filled with dates, notes, and details I did not understand yet. But one thing was clear. My grandmother had been preparing for this moment for a long time. And whatever she had discovered, she had been waiting for the right person to find it. The notebook felt heavier than it should have as I held it in my hands. It was only a small book with a faded blue cover, but I could feel the weight of every secret written inside those pages. My grandmother watched me carefully as I opened it for the first time. The handwriting was familiar, neat, steady, and organized, just like everything Evelyn Carter had done throughout her life. The first page contained dates. The second page contained names. The third page made me stop. It was a list of moments when things around my grandmother had started to change. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I saw my father's name, Richard. My mother's name, Laura. My brother's name, Daniel. I looked at my grandmother, waiting for an explanation. "Grandma, what is this?" I asked. She took a slow breath before answering. "It is everything I was afraid nobody would notice." I turned another page. There were notes about financial conversations, appointments, and decisions that had been made without her involvement. Nothing looked dramatic at first glance. That was what made it unsettling. It was not one big event. It was a pattern. Small things. Quiet things. Things that could easily be ignored if nobody paid attention. My grandmother had written down every time someone told her something was for her own good, without asking what she wanted. Every time a decision about her life was made while she was not included in the conversation. Every time she felt like her own voice mattered less inside her own family. "Why did you not tell me?" I whispered. She looked at me with tired but calm eyes. Because I knew what they thought of you. Her words surprised me. What do you mean? She closed the notebook gently. They think you are too trusting. They think you are too emotional. They think you are the last person who would notice what was happening. I looked down at the pages again. For years, my family had used the same description for me. Emily was sensitive. Emily worried too much. Emily never understood the bigger picture. But sitting there beside my grandmother, I began to wonder if the person they underestimated was the person they needed the most. What exactly are they trying to do? I asked. My grandmother looked toward the window. Outside, the afternoon sunlight moved across the quiet backyard where she had planted flowers for more than 30 years. I need you to find out for yourself, she said. Because if I tell you everything, they will say I influenced you. They will say I confused you. They will say I made you turn against them. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Not because I believed them, but because I knew how easily they could rewrite the story. They had done it before. When I changed careers, they said I was giving up. When I moved away, they said I was running away. When I chose my own path, they called it a mistake. Grandma, why me? I asked. She smiled softly. Because you are the only person who still sees me as Evelyn. Not as an obligation. Not as a responsibility. Not as someone who needs to be managed. Her answer stayed with me. I looked back at the notebook and noticed one final page that had been folded at the corner. I slowly opened it. There was only one sentence written there. The person they ignore is often the person they never prepare for. I read it twice. Then I heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. My parents were coming back. I quickly closed the notebook and placed it beside me. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like the least important person in the room. I felt like someone who had finally been trusted with something that mattered. And I knew that before I left my grandmother's house, I was going to understand exactly what she had been trying to reveal. After my parents returned to the living room, I watched them differently. Before that day, I had always searched for reasons to explain their behavior. I told myself they were stressed. I told myself they were busy. I told myself every family had complicated relationships. But sitting beside my grandmother, holding the notebook she had hidden for so long, I began to see the difference between misunderstanding someone and choosing not to see them. My father walked into the room first, followed by my mother. Their expressions were calm again. Almost too calm. Is everything okay? My father asked. I closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside my grandmother. Everything is fine, I answered. It was the first time in a long time that I gave him the same kind of simple response he had given me whenever I asked difficult questions. My mother smiled slightly. Your grandmother has always been a little dramatic about paperwork and family matters. I looked at my grandmother. She did not react. She simply folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window. That quiet reaction told me more than any argument could have. She was not angry. She was not trying to create conflict. She was someone who had spent months watching people make decisions around her without ever asking what she wanted. That evening, after my parents left, Grandma Evelyn and I sat together in her kitchen. The same kitchen where she had taught me how to make apple pie when I was a child. The same kitchen where she used to tell me that every person deserved to have a voice in their own story. I want to show you something, she said. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder filled with documents. Inside were copies of letters, notes from appointments, and records of conversations she had carefully written down. She had not collected them because she wanted revenge. She had collected them because she wanted to remember the truth. As I looked through the pages, I noticed something that made my heart sink. My parents had slowly taken control of more and more parts of her life. They had started by helping with simple things. Then they began speaking for her. Then they began making choices without including her. Each individual moment seemed small, but together they created a picture that was impossible to ignore. "Why did you let it continue for so long?" I asked gently. My grandmother looked at the old family photos hanging on the wall, because I kept hoping they would remember who I was. Her voice was soft. "I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, and grateful enough, they would stop seeing me as a problem to solve." Those words stayed with me because I understood them more than I wanted to admit. I had spent years doing the same thing, trying to become easier to accept, trying to prove I was worthy of being respected. "Grandma," I said, "what do you need me to do?" She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "I do not need you to fight for me, Emily. I need you to help me make sure the truth is not forgotten." The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I sat at my grandmother's dining table with a notebook, the folder, and a fresh cup of coffee beside me. For the first time, I was not looking at myself through my family's eyes. I was looking at the facts, the details, the choices people had made when they thought nobody was paying attention. And as I turned the pages, I found one entry that changed everything. A note written by my grandmother just 2 weeks earlier. It was short, it was clear, and it explained why she had sent me the secret message in the first place. The note was written in my grandmother's handwriting, but the words inside felt like they had been waiting for me for years. I held the paper carefully as I read the sentence at the top. "Emily, if you are reading this, it means I was right to trust you." I stopped for a moment. My grandmother had always been thoughtful with her words, but this felt different. It was not a simple message. It was a reminder that she had been preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. I continued reading. She explained that over the past year, she had noticed changes in the way my parents treated her. At first, she believed they were simply trying to help. Richard and Laura had always presented themselves as responsible family members who wanted the best for her. They offered to organize her appointments. They offered to handle certain household matters. They offered to make life easier. But slowly, the help became something different. They started making decisions without asking what she wanted. They started speaking about her future as if she was not sitting in the same room. They started using words like practical and necessary whenever she questioned them. My grandmother wrote that the most painful part was not the paperwork or the decisions. It was realizing that the people she loved were beginning to see her as a responsibility instead of a person. I looked up from the page and saw her sitting quietly across from me. At 78 years old, she still had the same gentle expression I remembered from childhood. But now I saw something else. I saw someone who had been carrying a burden silently because she did not want to create conflict. "Grandma," I said softly, "why did you not tell anyone?" She looked down at her hands. "Because families are complicated, Emily. Sometimes people hold on to the hope that things will change because accepting the truth hurts." Her answer reminded me of all the times I had done the same thing. I had ignored small comments from my parents. I had accepted being overlooked because I thought patience would eventually earn understanding. I had convinced myself that being the quiet one in the family was simply my place. But my grandmother's notebook showed me something important. Silence did not always mean peace. Sometimes silence only allowed problems to grow unnoticed. I turned back to the documents on the table. Among the notes was a name I did not expect to see. Daniel, my brother. The person my parents had always considered the successful one. The favorite. The example I was supposed to follow. I felt a strange sadness when I saw his name. Not anger. Not hatred. Just disappointment. Because I wondered if he knew what was happening or if he was only seeing the version of the story my parents wanted him to see. "Does Daniel know?" I asked. My grandmother paused before answering. "I do not know anymore." Those words stayed with me. My brother had always been the person my parents trusted most. If he was involved, even unknowingly, then the situation was more complicated than I imagined. That night, after my grandmother went to bed, I sat alone in her living room. The house was quiet except for the sound of the old clock above the fireplace. I looked through the papers again, searching for a pattern. I was no longer trying to prove that my family was wrong about me. I was trying to understand what had happened to my grandmother. Then I found something hidden between two pages. A copy of a document with a recent date. At the bottom was my father's signature. Next to it was a line that made me sit up straight. It was a decision made about my grandmother's future, without her approval. And suddenly, I understood why she had sent me those 3 words. She was not asking me to discover a secret. She was asking me to help her protect her voice before someone else decided she no longer needed one. The next morning, I woke up before the sun came through the windows of my grandmother's house. I had barely slept. My mind kept returning to the document I found the night before and the signature at the bottom. My father's name was there, a name I had trusted my entire life, a name that suddenly felt connected to questions I could no longer ignore. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the dining room table where my grandmother and I had spent so many mornings together. The room looked exactly the same as it always had. The wooden chairs, the small vase of flowers near the window, the family pictures on the shelves. But now I noticed things I had never noticed before, the details that told a different story. My grandmother's life was being discussed by everyone except my grandmother. I opened the folder again and began organizing the information. I did not want to make assumptions. I did not want anger to guide me. My grandmother had spent months carefully writing everything down, and I wanted to respect that. I started with dates, then conversations, then documents. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. My parents had convinced my grandmother that they were helping her manage things because they cared about her. But every step gave them more control over decisions that should have belonged to her. I remembered something my mother said the day before. Your grandmother has been confused lately. At the time, those words bothered me. Now they felt different. They sounded less like concern and more like an explanation they had prepared in advance. Around 10 in the morning, I heard my grandmother walking into the kitchen. She smiled when she saw me surrounded by papers. You have been busy, she said. I nodded. I am trying to understand everything. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from me. Be careful, Emily. Finding the truth is not always comfortable. I looked at her. Were you afraid they would be angry if you spoke up? She was quiet for a moment. I was afraid they would stop seeing me as family. Her answer stayed with me, because I understood that fear. Not in the same way, but enough to recognize it. For years, I had avoided difficult conversations with my parents because I did not want to lose the small amount of approval they gave me. I had accepted being overlooked because being included sometimes felt better than being rejected completely. But my grandmother had reached a point where staying silent was costing her something much more important. Her independence, her choices, her ability to decide what happened in her own life. Later that afternoon, I made a decision. I would not confront my parents yet. Not until I understood everything. I needed facts, not emotions. I needed to know whether my father and mother truly understood what they were doing or whether they had convinced themselves they were making the right choices. I called my brother Daniel. My hand hovered over the phone for several seconds before I pressed his name. When he answered, his voice sounded normal.
Familiar.
Emily? I did not expect to hear from you. I took a breath. Daniel, I need to ask you something about Grandma. There was a pause. A small pause. But I noticed it. What about her? He asked. I looked at the papers spread across the table. Did you know that decisions were being made about her future without her being involved? The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. And in that moment, I realized something. Either Daniel knew more than he had told me, or he was about to discover that the family story he believed was true had never been complete. Emily, he finally said quietly, "What exactly did Grandma tell you?" I looked toward the window where my grandmother's garden sat peacefully outside. For the first time, I was not afraid of asking questions, because I finally understood that questions were not a sign of weakness. Sometimes they were the only way to find the truth. Daniel did not answer my question right away. The silence between us felt different from the usual pauses in our conversations. Normally, when we talked, there was always something simple to discuss. Work, weather, family plans, safe topics that never required anyone to look too closely at what was happening underneath. But this time was different. "Emily," Daniel finally said, "I knew Grandma was having concerns, but I did not realize it had gone this far." I sat quietly at the dining room table, looking at the papers in front of me. "What does that mean?" I asked. He sighed. "It means I should have paid more attention." Those words surprised me. For most of my life, Daniel had seemed untouchable in our family. He was the son who could do no wrong, the one my parents celebrated, the one they trusted with important decisions. I had spent years believing he was simply better than me, more capable, more respected. But now, for the first time, I wondered if he had been living inside a story that was never completely true. "Did you know about the documents?" I asked. Another pause. "I knew Dad was helping Grandma organize things," he replied. "He told me it was because she was getting older and needed support." I looked down at the folder. Did Grandma ask for that support? Daniel did not respond immediately, and that was my answer. After our call ended, I stayed at the table for a long time. I thought about how easily people can accept a version of events when it comes from someone they trust. My parents had always been confident when they explained things. They spoke with certainty. They made their decisions sound reasonable. That was what made it difficult to question them. But my grandmother had done something my family rarely did. She had written things down. She had preserved details. She had created a record of her own experience. That afternoon, I asked my grandmother if there was anything else she wanted me to know. She looked at me carefully before answering. "There is one more thing," she said. She walked to the bookshelf in the living room and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures from years ago, birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, moments that looked perfect from the outside. She turned to a photograph of my father when he was younger. "Your father was not always like this," she said. "People change slowly, sometimes so slowly that the people around them do not notice." Her words were not angry. That was what affected me the most. She was not trying to make me hate my parents. She was trying to help me understand. "Grandma, do you think they know they are hurting you?" I asked. She looked down at the photo album. "I think they believe they are doing what is best. That is what makes some choices difficult. People can convince themselves they are right." That evening, I made a plan. I would not accuse anyone. I would not walk into my parents' home with anger and expectations. I would simply observe. I would listen. I would ask questions. The next day, my parents invited me to lunch. They probably thought I was still the same Emily they had always known. The daughter who avoided conflict. The daughter who accepted explanations without asking for more. But I was not walking into that restaurant as the person they remembered. I arrived early and sat near the window. When Richard and Laura entered, they smiled as if everything was normal. My mother hugged me. My father asked about my drive. For a moment, it almost felt like any other family lunch. Then my father mentioned my grandmother. "She has been difficult lately," he said casually. I looked at him and noticed the confidence in his voice. The same confidence he always had when he believed nobody would challenge him. I placed my hands on the table and calmly asked, "What exactly do you mean by difficult?" The conversation stopped. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at me. And for the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty on their faces. Because they were beginning to realize something had changed. I was no longer the daughter who stayed quiet. I was the daughter who had started asking questions they never expected to answer. The lunch with my parents ended differently than any conversation we had ever shared before. For years, I had been the person who listened quietly while they explained how things worked. They spoke and I accepted. They decided and I adjusted. But that day, sitting across from them in the small restaurant near my grandmother's neighborhood, I realized something had changed. I was no longer searching for their approval. I was searching for the truth. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Emily, I think your grandmother has been influenced by people who do not understand her situation." His words sounded careful, almost rehearsed. I looked at him and remembered the notebook sitting safely in my bag. The dates, the notes, the details my grandmother had recorded when she believed nobody was listening. "What people?" I asked. My father hesitated. It was only a second, but it was enough. "You know how older people can become worried about things," my mother added. "Sometimes they misunderstand help." I looked at my mother. For years, I had wanted her to see me as someone capable, someone intelligent, someone worth taking seriously. But now I understood that this was not only about me. This was about my grandmother, a woman who had spent her entire life caring for others and was now being treated like her own opinions were no longer important. "Did Grandma ask you to make these decisions for her?" I asked. The question changed the atmosphere immediately. My parents looked at each other. They did not answer. And that silence told me more than any explanation could have. After lunch, I drove back to my grandmother's house. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, reading a book with a cup of tea beside her. When she saw my expression, she knew something had happened. "You spoke with them," she said. I nodded. "They believe they are right." My grandmother smiled sadly. "Many people do." I sat beside her and told her everything that was said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she simply looked outside, at the garden she had cared for decades. "Emily, there is something you need to understand. The hardest part of being ignored is not that people forget your words. It is that they start making you question whether your words matter." Her sentence stayed with me, because I realized that was exactly what had happened to me too. I had spent years wondering if my opinions were valuable. I had accepted being dismissed because I thought maybe everyone else knew better. But my grandmother's courage had reminded me of something I had forgotten. Respect was not something someone else gave you permission to have. It was something you deserved because you were human. That evening, I called Daniel again. This time, he sounded different. More thoughtful. More uncertain. "I talked to Dad," he said. He did not explain everything. I sat down at the kitchen table. "What do you mean?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. There are things I should have asked about earlier. It was the first time I heard regret in his voice. Not an apology yet. Not a complete understanding. But a beginning. "Daniel," I said, "Grandma does not want to fight. She wants her choices respected." He sighed. "I know." The next morning, I returned to the folder and reviewed every document again. I was not looking for a reason to blame my family. I was looking for a way to protect my grandmother's voice. Then I found another detail hidden among the papers. A meeting had been scheduled for the following week. A meeting where decisions about my grandmother's future were supposed to be finalized. But there was one problem. My grandmother had never agreed to it. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I needed to be there before anyone else could decide her story for her. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning at my grandmother's attorney's office. I arrived early, carrying the folder of documents my grandmother had trusted me with. For the first time in my life, I was walking into a room where my voice mattered. I was not there as the daughter everyone underestimated. I was there as the person my grandmother chose to stand beside her. When I entered the conference room, my parents were already there. My father looked surprised when he saw me. My mother's expression changed for just a moment before she quickly smiled. "Emily, what are you doing here?" my father asked. His tone was polite, but I could hear the question behind the question. "Why are you involved? Why are you not staying quiet?" I placed my bag on the table and sat beside my grandmother. She reached over and gently held my hand. That small gesture gave me more confidence than any speech could have. A few minutes later, the attorney entered with a stack of papers. His name was Michael Reynolds, and he had known my grandmother for many years. He greeted her warmly before looking around the room. "Before we begin, Evelyn wanted to make sure everyone understood that today is about her choices and her wishes." My father immediately responded, "Of course, that is exactly what we want." "But I noticed something," he answered too quickly. The attorney opened the folder in front of him. "There have been some concerns about recent decisions made regarding Evelyn's personal affairs." The room became quiet. My mother looked uncomfortable. My father leaned forward. "I think there has been a misunderstanding." Michael calmly looked through the documents. "Then this should be easy to clarify." One by one, he reviewed the information. The conversations that had taken place without my grandmother present. The plans that had been discussed before she gave approval. The assumptions that had been made about what she needed instead of asking what she wanted. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. That was what made the moment so powerful. The truth did not need anger to be heard. It only needed to be placed in front of everyone. My father looked at my grandmother. "Mom, we were only trying to help." My grandmother nodded slowly. "I know you believe that." Her voice was gentle. "But helping someone does not mean taking away their ability to choose." Those words changed the room, because they were not spoken with bitterness. They were spoken with clarity. I looked at my grandmother and realized something I had never fully understood before. Strength did not always look like confidence. Sometimes strength was simply a person who had been ignored for a long time finally deciding that their voice deserved space. My brother Daniel arrived halfway through the meeting. When he walked in, he looked nervous. He had clearly learned more since our last conversation. He sat quietly and listened as the details were explained. After several minutes, he looked at our grandmother. "I am sorry I did not ask more questions," he said. My grandmother reached toward him. "What matters is that you are asking now." It was not a perfect ending. Families rarely change in one conversation. There were still difficult feelings. There were still things that needed to be repaired. But something important had happened. The person everyone thought was powerless had finally been heard. And the daughter everyone believed would never understand had become the person who helped make that possible. When we left the office that morning, my grandmother stopped at the front steps and looked at the sunlight coming through the trees. She smiled. "You know, Emily, I always knew you were stronger than they believed." I looked at her and smiled back. For years, I had wondered if my family was right about me. That day, I finally knew they were not.